October 5th, 2017. In the journal Science, a team of geneticists led by Eske Willerslev. Let's start with the site itself, because Sungheer isn't just old. It's one of the most extraordinary windows into the deep human past that archaeology has ever produced. Radiocarbon dating places the deposits at Sungheer at roughly 34,000 years old, placing the site right at the interface between the early and middle Upper Paleolithic, and making these burials the oldest securely dated modern human interments anywhere in Europe. Hunter? Gatherers who roamed the Russian plains began burying their dead here around 34,000 years ago, and archaeologists have never stopped being fascinated by what they found. The first human fossil ever discovered at the site, the Sungheer 5 cranium, was pulled from the ground in 1964, kicking off decades of careful, painstaking excavation that eventually revealed one of the richest Ice Age burial complexes anywhere on the planet. What makes Sungheer so unusual isn't just its age. It's the sheer, almost incomprehensible wealth buried alongside these bodies. In the first grave, an adult male now known as Sungheer 1 was buried together with thousands of beads made of mammoth ivory, almost certainly sewn directly onto the clothing he was buried in. In a separate burial, two younger individuals, Sungheer 2 and Sungheer 3, were interred head-to-head, and they too were covered in approximately 10,000 ivory beads each, sized slightly smaller, as though scaled specifically to fit their smaller frames. The two children have been estimated at somewhere between 9 and 14 years old, a boy and a girl covered in red ochre pigment, buried with an extraordinary array of grave goods. Among the objects recovered from these graves, a belt made from almost 300 individually pierced fox canine teeth and a dozen separate ivory spears, including one measuring an astonishing 2.5 meters in length, a length that would have required extraordinary skill and time to carve from mammoth tusk without cracking it. To put that kind of labor investment in context, estimates of how long it took to carve just the beads found in these graves run into the thousands of hours of skilled craftsmanship, invested entirely in preparing people for burial, in a society that by any modern standard would be considered desperately poor, surviving in one of the harshest environments human beings have ever inhabited. 3. And then there's the detail that has haunted archaeologists for decades, the strange, almost unsettling object found tucked directly beside the two buried children. Right next to Sungheer 2, excavators found a human femoral, diaphysis, a thigh bone shaft, that had come from an entirely different fourth individual. This bone had been deliberately broken, carefully polished, hollowed out, and packed full of red ochre pigment before being placed in the children's grave. Researchers described the discovery in stark terms in their published paper. Adjacent to the children lay the femoral diaphysis of an adult, polished, hollowed out, and filled with red ochre. Whoever this fourth person was, their body wasn't buried whole, just this single, deliberately modified bone, treated with obvious ritual care, placed as though it were meant to accompany these two children into whatever came after death. For decades, the leading theory speculated that this entire elaborate arrangement, two children buried together with parts of another adult's body, must represent some kind of close family tragedy. Siblings, perhaps, buried together with a piece of their father or grandfather laid beside them for comfort in the afterlife. That's exactly the assumption the 2017 DNA study demolished. Researchers were able to sequence the complete genomes of all 4 individuals recovered from the 2 Sungheer graves, individuals who all appear to have been alive at roughly the same time, and compared that genetic data against a huge library of both modern and ancient human genomes from around the world. To the researchers' genuine surprise, none of these 4 individuals turned out to be closely related to each other in genetic terms. At the very most, they were second cousins, and this held true even for the 2 children buried head-to-head in the very same grave, dressed identically, buried together with obvious symbolic intention. Genetic comparisons found no signs of any close biological kinship whatsoever among the group. No parent-child relationship, no grandparents, no siblings, no aunts, uncles, nieces, or nephews turned up anywhere in the data. Even the mysterious ochre-filled femur, the bone fragment from that 4th individual laid so carefully beside the children, turned out to belong to someone no closer than a great-great-grandfather to the boy buried nearby. The scientists leading the study didn't hide how much this contradicted their own expectations going in. This goes against what many would have predicted, said Eske Willerslev, senior author of the study, in a statement following publication. I think many researchers had assumed that the people of Sungheer were very closely related, especially the 2 youngsters from the same grave. There was even an added twist buried in the genetic data that overturned decades of physical anthropology as well. Ancient DNA, extracted from the sex chromosomes of all 4 Sungheer individuals, showed that every single one of them was male, including the child scientists had long suspected, based purely on skeletal analysis, might actually have been a girl. Decades of careful bone measurement, and it took a genetic test to finally settle a detail that basic. So if these people weren't family, what exactly was going on at Songhir? This is where the discovery stops being simply surprising and becomes something genuinely profound about how early human societies were actually organized. Professor Martin. Sikora of the Center for Geogenetics at the University of Copenhagen, who led the genetic analysis, explained the implication directly. Small family bands are likely to have interconnected with larger networks, facilitating the exchange of people between groups in order to maintain diversity. In other words, these weren't isolated, inward-looking family units, huddled together and reproducing only among themselves, the way small, cut-off populations often do out of pure necessity. Willerslev summarized the deeper meaning behind the finding. What this means is that even people in the Upper Paleolithic, who were living in tiny groups, understood the importance of avoiding inbreeding. The data that we have suggests that it was being purposely avoided. These were people living in small bands, likely numbering only a handful of individuals at any one time. And yet somehow, deliberately, they had already worked out a functioning system for finding mates outside their own immediate group, maintaining connections and exchange relationships across a much wider social network stretching far beyond whoever they happened to be sharing a campfire with on any given night. The scale of that achievement becomes even clearer once you understand exactly how small these groups really were. The study's own conclusions describe individuals at Songhir as deriving from a population of small effective size, with limited kinship and levels of inbreeding comparable to those found among modern hunter-gatherer populations, studied by anthropologists today. Modern hunter-gatherer societies, the ones anthropologists have been able to directly study and interview over the past century, maintain complex kinship rules, trading relationships, and seasonal gatherings specifically designed to connect small, scattered bands into much larger breeding networks, preventing the kind of genetic collapse that comes from too many generations of a tiny group reproducing only among itself. What the Songhir genomes reveal is that this same basic social technology, this same deliberate strategy of reaching outward for mates rather than remaining biologically isolated, was already firmly in place among some of the very first successful modern humans to settle in Europe, tens of thousands of years before anyone could have written the idea down or passed it on as formal cultural knowledge. It had to have been baked into the basic social fabric of how these people organized their entire lives. There's a genetically thrilling detail buried even deeper in the Songhir genomes, one that connects this single burial site all the way back to the very root of the modern human family tree. Phylogenetic analysis of the Y chromosome sequences recovered from the Songhir remains placed all of these individuals within an early, deeply divergent lineage of a genetic marker known as haplogroup C182. That specific haplogroup is now vanishingly rare among people alive today, found in only scattered pockets scattered thinly across parts of the world, a genetic lineage that has mostly been replaced, outcompeted, or simply diluted into near invisibility over the tens of thousands of years since these men lived and died on the Russian plain. Finding it preserved intact inside bones, this old is like discovering an entire branch of the human family tree that mostly went extinct everywhere else on Earth, still clinging to life in one small snow-covered burial ground in western Russia. Now here's where this story connects to an even bigger genetic bombshell, discovered a few years earlier at a site not far away, along the same river system running through this same corner of Russia. Roughly 200 kilometers to the south, at a site called Kostenki, researchers recovered the remains of a short, dark-skinned man, found in 1954, who lived somewhere between roughly 38,700 and 36,200 years ago, making him even older than the Songhir burials, and one of the oldest modern human skeletons ever recovered from European soil. When Willerslev's team, the same scientist who would later lead the Songhir study, extracted and sequenced this man's genome from a sample taken out of his own arm bone, they found something that stunned population geneticists around the world. This single ancient man already carried DNA representing all three of the major genetic components that make up modern European ancestry today. According to Willerslev, this made the Kostenki man already, in a genuine sense, pure European, carrying the full genetic recipe that would eventually define an entire continent's population. Tens of thousands of years before, that recipe was supposedly assembled through separate later migrations. That finding directly overturned a leading theory of European ancestry that had dominated the field right up until that moment. One especially prominent, highly regarded study published shortly before had proposed that each of these three genetic components entered Europe through entirely separate migration waves, arriving at different times from different directions, and that they only finally combined together inside most Europeans' DNA within roughly the last 5,000 years. The Kostenki genome blew that timeline apart. Johannes Krause of the University of Tübingen, commenting on the significance of the find, called it A striking finding that the Kostenki-14 genome already has the three major European components present that we detect in modern Europeans, a detail that meant these three ancestral threads had already been mixing and combining inside real, living human populations tens of thousands of years earlier than anyone had previously proven. The physical picture researchers were able to reconstruct from this man's DNA adds a genuinely fascinating, almost uncomfortable layer to the story of what the first Europeans actually looked like. Genetic analysis of the Kostenki genome indicated the man had dark skin and dark eyes, a striking contrast to the pale skin most people today unconsciously associate with ancient European ancestry, a visible reminder that the genes controlling lighter skin tones common across modern Europe today only spread widely much later, long after these earliest successful populations had already established themselves across the continent. His genome also carried roughly 1% more Neanderthal DNA than is typically found in Europeans and Asians alive today, a detail that helped researchers confirm that interbreeding between modern humans and Neanderthals had already occurred before 45,000 years ago, likely somewhere in the Middle East, well before modern humans had even finished spreading across the rest of the European continent. The Kostenki and Sungheer genomes, taken together, tell a connected story that neither site could fully reveal on its own. Genetic comparisons between the two sites found that the population living at Kostenki had, over time, been at least partially replaced by later groups more closely related to the people eventually buried at Sungheer, suggesting a slow, ongoing churn of populations moving through, settling, and eventually being succeeded by newcomers across this exact stretch of the Russian plain, over a span of tens of thousands of years. According to research out of Cambridge, examining the Kostenki genome also revealed evidence pointing to a previously unrecognized human population lineage, one as ancient as the very earliest splits that occurred among modern human populations after they first left Africa, a hidden branch of humanity's family tree that nobody had previously identified, sitting quietly preserved inside a single ancient skeleton from a Russian riverbank. And there's one more genuinely chilling comparison buried inside the Sungheer research, one that helps explain something far bigger than just the fate of one burial site. Why modern humans succeeded in populating an entire continent when an earlier, physically formidable species of human being ultimately did not. Reflecting on why the Sungheer group so carefully avoided inbreeding, geneticist Martin Sikora directly contrasted their behavior against a very different genetic picture that had emerged from studying Neanderthal remains. We don't know why the Altai Neanderthal groups were inbred. Maybe they were isolated and that was the only option. Or maybe they really did fail to develop a network of connections. We will need more genomic data of diverse Neanderthal populations to be sure. The study's own published conclusions state it plainly. The small reproductive groups of Upper Paleolithic modern humans at Sungheer apparently avoided inbreeding and its harmful genetic consequences, in stark contrast to what has been documented among certain Neanderthal populations studied elsewhere. A previously sequenced Neanderthal genome, recovered from the Altai region of Siberia, had shown clear, unmistakable signs of severe, repeated inbreeding, generation after generation of extremely close relatives reproducing together, likely because that particular Neanderthal population simply had nowhere else to turn, no wider network of unrelated groups to reach out to when it came time to find a mate. Put those two genetic pictures side by side and you get a genuinely compelling explanation for one of the biggest remaining mysteries in all of human evolution. Why our species eventually thrived across an entire continent that Neanderthals had already called home for hundreds of thousands of years, while Neanderthals themselves eventually vanished completely. It likely wasn't a single dramatic battle, or one species simply out-hunting or out-fighting the other in some prehistoric war. Based on what these bones and this DNA reveal, the real advantage may have been something far quieter and far more human in the modern sense of the word. An early, deliberate talent for building social connections beyond the immediate family group, for trading, communicating, and mating across a much wider network of unrelated bands scattered across the landscape, exchanging not just genes, but presumably knowledge, tools, and alliances along with them. Neanderthal populations, at least based on the Altai genome, may have simply lacked that same wide social safety net, leaving them trapped generation after generation in smaller, more isolated, more inbred groups, increasingly vulnerable as the climate and the competition around them kept shifting. That's the real deeper story hiding underneath all those thousands of painstakingly carved ivory beads at Sungheer. It isn't just a story about how lavishly a group of Ice Age hunter-gatherers chose to bury their dead, though the sheer scale of that effort remains staggering on its own. It's a story about how, more than 30,000 years before anyone would ever write a single word down, a small, cold, desperately vulnerable group of human beings on the Russian plain had already discovered something profound about survival. that reaching outward, building relationships beyond your own bloodline, trading partners and mates and knowledge across an entire landscape of otherwise unrelated strangers, wasn't just a nice cultural flourish. It may have been the single quiet advantage that let an entire species outlast every other kind of human that ever walked beside it, carried forward, bead by painstakingly carved bead, into every one of us still here today. There's one more piece of the story that doesn't come from DNA at all, but from something almost as revealing, a careful physical examination of the children's own skeletons, and it adds a genuinely unexpected, almost tragic dimension to everything the genetic data had already revealed. Because it turns out that alongside the fact that these two children weren't biologically related, their bones tell us that at least one of them was living and dying, with a serious physical condition that modern medicine can still recognize today. Sungir 3, the younger of the two children, identified through dental analysis as somewhere between 9 and 10 years old, had legs that simply weren't shaped like a typical child's. Researchers examining her skeleton found that her femora, the long bones running from hip to knee, were pathologically foreshortened and anteriorly bowed, curving forward along their entire length in a smooth, regular arc, with the most pronounced curve sitting right at the midpoint of each bone. Crucially, both legs showed the exact same degree of shortening and bowing. With no asymmetry between the left and right side, a detail that matters enormously to researchers, because asymmetrical bowing usually points toward an injury or localized trauma affecting just one limb, while symmetrical bowing, appearing identically in both legs, points instead toward something built into her body from birth. Based on that pattern, researchers concluded her condition most closely matches what medical literature describes as congenital bowing of long bones, a rare developmental condition present from birth, rather than something that happened to her later in childhood. That detail on its own is striking enough. A 9-year-old girl living tens of thousands of years ago with legs that had likely never grown or moved the way most people's do. But researchers went even further, cross-referencing her skeletal condition against a specific hypothesis raised by earlier scholars, that her bowed femora might have been linked to a diabetic condition in her own mother during pregnancy, a recognized modern cause of exactly this kind of congenital bone bowing in newborns. If that connection holds, it means the genetic story at Sungir isn't just about who this girl wasn't related to. It's a story that reaches back into her own mother's body, into a Pleistocene pregnancy, complicated by a metabolic condition modern doctors still diagnose and manage today, thousands of generations before anyone had a name for it. And yet, despite that congenital condition, researchers found something almost quietly remarkable when they studied how her body had actually adapted to it over her short life. Her femoral and tibial asymmetry between limbs and the angles at which her thigh bones met her knees showed patterns consistent with essentially normal, non-pathological posture and movement. And the rigidity measured in her weight-bearing shin bones, along with her non-dominant left arm, reflected ordinary, healthy patterns of weight-bearing and everyday manipulation, the kind of bone strength you'd expect from a child who was regularly active, walking, working, and using her body normally despite the unusual shape of her legs. In other words, whatever her congenital condition actually was, it doesn't appear to have stopped her from living an active, physically engaged childhood right up until the day she died, adapting her whole gait and movement pattern around legs that curved in a way most people's never do. There's even a detail, suggesting unusually elevated strength specifically in her right upper arm bone, creating a pronounced asymmetry between her left and right arms, alongside elevated markers of muscle attachment strength, hints of a child who had, over her short decade of life, developed a genuinely particular and individual pattern of physical use and habit, the kind of biomechanical fingerprint that comes only from years of a very specific way of moving through the world. Beyond the bowing itself, her teeth tell an even broader story about the hardships of her short life. Based on her dental enamel hypoplasias, essentially bands of disrupted enamel growth that form during periods of serious physical stress in childhood, along with certain transverse growth lines in her bones, researchers concluded that this child endured severe and persistent systemic stress throughout essentially her entire decade of life. Dental enamel doesn't lie the way skin and soft tissue eventually do. Every episode of serious illness, malnutrition, or physical crisis a child experiences during their growing years leaves a permanent, datable line etched directly into the enamel of their teeth, a kind of biological growth ring recording every hardship along the way. For this particular child, those growth rings tell a story of repeated, serious struggle stacked on top of a congenital bone condition that had shaped the very structure of her legs since the moment she was born. Her grave companion, the older child known as Sungir 2, estimated at somewhere between 12 and 14 years old, presents his own distinct set of puzzles. Researchers studying his remains noted a curious lack of dental wear, an underdeveloped chewing muscle attachment for someone his age, alongside osteolytic cysts, small areas where bone tissue had broken down, and what may have been a perimortem injury, meaning damage that occurred at or right around the time of death. Researchers have been careful and appropriately cautious about how far to push that last detail, explicitly noting it would be highly speculative to claim any of these injuries played a direct role in his actual death. A reminder that even with extraordinary preservation like this, some questions about exactly how these two children's lives ended remain genuinely unanswerable, no matter how closely modern science examines their remains. Layer all of this on top of what the DNA revealed, and the emotional weight of this specific burial only grows heavier. Two children, unrelated by blood, at least one of them carrying a lifelong congenital condition affecting the very shape of her legs, both of them showing clear physical evidence of real hardship and stress throughout their short lives, buried together head to head with a staggering, almost unimaginable degree of ceremonial care. Roughly 10,000 carefully carved ivory beads apiece, a fox-tooth belt, spears carved from mammoth tusk, ochre pigment covering every inch of their bodies, and laid carefully beside them a piece of an entirely different adult's thigh bone, hollowed and filled with more of that same red pigment. Whatever social bond connected these two children to each other, and to whichever community decided they deserved a burial this extraordinary, it clearly wasn't simple blood kinship. It was something else, some other form of connection or significance that this Ice Age society considered important enough to invest an almost unbelievable amount of labor and material wealth into honoring. The population picture behind all of this adds one final sobering piece of context to just how remarkable the whole Sungheer mating network discovery really is. Genetic modeling based on the Sungheer genomes suggests these people were living in a population of a genuinely small effective size, the kind of tiny scattered group sizes anthropologists associate with hunter-gatherer bands rather than anything resembling a large settled community. Comparing that picture against other early ancient genomes recovered from across Eurasia during roughly this same broad period, including individuals like the roughly 45,000-year-old man discovered at Ust-Ishim in Siberia, one of the oldest modern human genomes ever sequenced anywhere on Earth, has helped researchers build an increasingly detailed picture of just how thin, scattered, and precarious the very earliest populations of modern humans in northern Eurasia genuinely were. These weren't thriving, densely populated societies with population numbers to spare. They were small, isolated bands, spread thinly across an unforgiving Ice Age landscape, and the fact that they still managed to organize a functioning system of exchange and outbreeding across that same thin, scattered landscape is precisely what makes the discovery so remarkable. It wasn't an easy problem to solve. It was, if anything, one of the hardest possible versions of that problem. Vanishingly few people, spread across an enormous frozen expanse of land, somehow still finding each other often enough and deliberately enough to keep their bloodlines from collapsing in on themselves the way evidence suggests at least one isolated Neanderthal populations did. There's a genuinely striking postscript to this entire story, too, one that shows just how long it eventually took for something we now take completely for granted to actually show up in the archaeological record. According to researchers who study ancient kinship patterns across Eurasia, the earliest molecular identification of an actual nuclear family, a mother, a father, and their biological child, all found buried and genetically confirmed together in a single clear family unit, doesn't appear anywhere in the ancient DNA record until roughly 30,000 years after the time period Sungheer itself represents. 30,000 years. That's how long it took after these elaborately dressed, deliberately unrelated children were laid to rest head to head under 10,000 ivory beads each before archaeologists have found solid genetic proof of a simple biological nuclear family being buried together anywhere in the ancient human record. Whatever social structure these people at Sungheer were actually living inside, it clearly wasn't built around the same tight biological nuclear family unit so much of the modern world now treats as the obvious default building block of human society. It was something broader, more networked, more deliberately woven outward across unrelated bands and distant strangers, and it worked well enough, for long enough, to help carry an entire species through the coldest, harshest stretch of the last Ice Age, all the way down to every single person reading this today.